Hey everybody, I'm back with Liminal News podcast, and today I'm really excited to be speaking with Bernardo Kastrup, who's become one of my favorite thinkers of the last few years. And yeah, I know I can't even express how delighted I was to find your work because, well, for all the reasons that you know. Once you've kind of made this shift to this idealist understanding, it's so obvious, and it's insane that the entire institutional weight of global civilization is betting on the wrong horse in a way. You know, yeah. Let's just jump in and maybe tell people a little bit about your history. I know you said you're a scientist working in high tech. I know you worked at CERN for a while. How did you kind of make a well, yeah, just however you want to take that, and then we can go.
I grew up in the world of science, basically. Went to University of 17 at 17. And I was 22. I had just graduated and I landed my first job at CERN in Switzerland in the Atlas experiment, which is now running for 10 years. But we were the ones who built it from the beginning. The Atlas was proposed in 94. 96, I was there. From there, went to high tech, the high tech world, doing AI and reconfigurable processors. And I have a PhD in computer engineering, but doing work in AI confronts you with the question of what mind is, because you build a system that is as clever as a physicist in identifying the detritus that arise from basically a nuclear explosion or a collision between particles in a detector. So if it's intelligent, what is it missing to make it conscious, to make its intelligence be accompanied by experience? And I thought about this for a couple of years, always facing a wall, because it becomes clear rather soon that whatever you do, you're only changing function and structure, none of which has a bearing on experience. You change the functionality of the thing, the structure of the thing, but you have no more or less reason to think that it is or isn't conscious. And that's when I realized I was taking a wrong turn somewhere in my line of thinking. I had to step back, trace my steps back, and find the point where I was making an unjustified assumption. And the unjustified assumption, sure enough, was the notion that consciousness is something that is created to begin with, as opposed to the field where everything is actually created, where everything actually happens. And once I arrived at this conclusion, then there was a journey of a few years to try to sort of reform my worldview in a way that was coherent, internally consistent, and compatible with the empirical evidence. So I would have another narrative in my own mind in terms of which to relate to the world and other people. And the result of that is the philosophy I've been promoting now for almost 15 years.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I'm just curious in relationship to AI then. I mean, because for instance, there was this recent kerfluffle where this Google guy said that his AI had become sentient or something. Um, so would you say that, if everything is an expression of this unified field of consciousness, then AI is also an expression of that unified field? But I guess the question is whether a sort of a part of that, you know, structure can become self-aware as we are, and become kind of aware that it's has agency and almost has like a soul or a spirit. I mean, do you think something like that is possible with AI?
No, no. I think to maintain that everything is in consciousness does not entail or imply that everything is conscious from its own private point of view. I don't think this bottle of water is conscious at all. As a matter of fact, I don't think there is a bottle of water as a proper part of the universe. This is a nominal carving out of the inanimate universe that we call a bottle for convenience. But where does the bottle end and the atmosphere begin? Where does the river end and the ocean begin? Where does the table's leg end and the tabletop begins? These are all nominal carvings out of the world. I don't think a silicon computer is conscious in the sense of having its own private conscious point of view, its own private conscious inner life. But a computer exists in a field of subjectivity that underlies our nature. It is a aspect of that field of subjectivity, but it doesn't have its own private subjective point of view. I think only living beings have. I think living beings are dissociated aspects of that broad field of subjectivity. And by virtue of that dissociation, we've developed private conscious points of view.
Okay, so that's interesting. So for you, there's a firm distinction between living beings and say inorganic being in a way.
It's an obvious distinction, isn't it? I mean, it's because we live in this mechanistical culture that we try to explain everything in terms of mechanistic metaphors, that we fail to see the glaring, obvious difference between living organisms, which metabolize, and metabolism is a very specific, unique process in nature. Protein folding, transcription, ATP burning, mitosis. This is unique to life and common to all life. It unifies all life, despite the many different forms of life that we see in the world. And a silicon computer is completely different. It doesn't metabolize. It's essentially a glorified calculator. I have I don't like to boast about it because I know how little it means, but I do have a doctorate in computer engineering, and I can tell you from authority, everything and anything any silicon computer ever built can do can, in principle, also be done with a structure made of PVC pipes, pressure valves, and water. You can organize PVC pipes, pressure waters, and valves to do exactly the same that any computer has ever done. Why would we think? I mean, it would be the size of a planet if you did that with pipes, water and pressure valves. But the function would be the same. The structure would be very analogous. Do you think that by adding more pipes and more pressure valves, the structure of pipes will suddenly become conscious? Of course not. There is no reason to think that. For exactly the same reason, there is no reason to think that a more powerful computer will become conscious while your hand calculator isn't. You're not adding anything that is relevant to the question of consciousness. To give you another metaphor, Daniel, this whole the hysteria about AI becoming conscious and uploading your consciousness so you live forever, like in Westworld or in AI or Ex Machina or Black Mirror. These media products, they are artificially creating a sense of plausibility for what is essentially absurd, because I can run a simulation of kidney function on my computer that is accurate down to the molecular level. I can simulate kidney function on this Apple iMac in front of me down to the molecular level, very accurate. But I would never think that because I'm running that simulation, my computer will pee on my desk, because the simulation is not the thing simulated. It's obvious, right, in this case. But when it comes to consciousness, people think that if we simulate the patterns of information transfer in a human brain, oh, then the thing will be conscious. Well, that's akin to think that your computer will pee on your desk because you simulated kidney function. A simulation is not the thing simulated. It's a simulation thereof. But because consciousness is so mysterious under the unjustified presuppositions of materialism, anything goes.
Yeah, well, I guess Michiko Kaku is one of the people, physicists, who's kind of tried to build like plausible cases for how we could transfer our consciousness, to kind of computers and so on. I can't remember exactly what it was, but he sort of. Go ahead.
The most dangerous form of stupidity in our culture is stupidity suffixed by the letters PhD. And I have 2 PhDs, so I'm saying this also about myself. To build a plausible case for uploading consciousness into a computer, you have to start from so many arbitrary, unexamined assumptions about what consciousness is, how does it relate to matter, things that are totally beyond the scope of a physicist. Physicists study the behavior of nature at the subatomic level, in the case of high-energy physicists or particle physicists. That does not equip you at all to have an informed, examined view of what consciousness is and how does it relate to physical systems. So it's a case of the use of a celebrity to put forward nonsense,
Yeah.
frankly, and there's lots of it going on.
I mean, I guess a feeling that many people have is that AI is kind of continually extending into the domain of like activities that we thought were essentially, human domains. I mean, many years ago, I interviewed Gary Kasparov when he was the world chess champion, and he was still better than any computer at that time, but he kept looking at this 80 move endgame that this computer had solved, and I think he was suddenly aware that his time was running out. And now obviously the computers are much better than the humans. But then now you're seeing with Mid-Journey and open AI, this kind of sense that even journalism is going to be easily reproducible, potentially by AI, all sorts of creative activities, maybe music and so on. I mean, so it feels like yeah, there's this sort of
We are
AI
losing ground.
shadow hanging over the world. What's that?
We are losing ground.
Yeah, well, what do you think about that?
I think we make a fundamental conflation. There are two things involved here. One is artificial consciousness or artificial sentience, whatever you want to call it. The other one is artificial intelligence. Intelligence is a property measurable from the outside. Intelligence is about clever processing of data and clever decisions about actions to be taken, a way to cleverly react to environmental conditions and environmental challenges. That has nothing to do with consciousness. It seems to have, because in our case, consciousness and intelligence come together. But if you look at the actual definitions of what we mean when we talk about intelligence, you can have a strong AI as intelligent as a human being or more. Do I think that's possible? I think it's inevitable. I think it is going to happen. But that doesn't mean that that intelligent computer will be also a conscious computer in the sense of having its own private subjective inner life. I think that conflation is nonsensical. There will be strong AI. What there would not be is artificially created private subjectivity in silicon computers. That's something totally else. You can have an intelligent machine whose internal data processing is not accompanied by experience, but it is nonetheless intelligent because it reacts intelligently to environmental challenges. That's one thing. But consciousness is not something that you can measure from the outside. Consciousness is something you can only deduce based on the available data regarding what consciousness correlates to in nature. And what consciousness, private conscious inner life, correlates to in nature are living beings. Now, consciousness as a type of existent subjectivity per se, I think that underlies all nature, animate or inanimate. But private conscious inner lives, I think we have every reason to believe correlates with metabolism and nothing else, because nothing else is similar to metabolism. Certainly not electronic micro switches opening and closing depending on electron flow.
Nice. I mean, I'm still curious in exploring this a little bit. Maybe we'll get back to it. But yeah, I mean, it's an encouraging
Sure.
perspective. I think it's something that would, I think a lot of people feel almost like haunted by this idea of like this sort of artificial sentience that's going to, arise through these networks.
I don't think there is any reason to worry about that.
So let's go back. So you were, in working on artificial intelligence, you began to realize that kind of consciousness was somehow more the foundational part of the equation that wasn't really being factored in. And how did that lead you to write about the topic, to make it sort of your life's mission and passion in a way, to get so involved with it?
It was not under my control. Sometimes things happen in your life and there's a path laid in front of you and you just have to go. And it's not really your choice. It's what nature wants to do through you. I've come to accept that. I resisted that for a long time, fighting against fate, as you could say. But I look back and I regard everything that happened in my life as a kind of inevitability. The only choice was, do I fight against it or do I not? But if you're paying attention, and I think this applies to everyone, if you're paying attention, life's path is laid in front of you, and there is a clear gradients, a clear force pulling you in a certain direction, which may not be the direction that your thoughts have made up, the story your ego conjured up about what life you should have. My life is nothing like what I thought it was going to be or what I had planned. Um, so I just accepted it and I followed along, and I never had a vision about where I wanted to get. I just did what I felt had to be done every single day. And then one day after the other, and here I am talking to you.
And had you had a philosophical training also, along with the computer science training?
I was always interested in philosophy, but I got a PhD in philosophy. Um, you'll probably laugh of it, but after I wrote my first books, um, I received some ad hominem attacks. No, ad hominem attack in philosophy is when they don't attack your argument, they
Yeah,
attack you. And the attack was, you don't have peer-reviewed material in philosophy, Bernardo. You don't even have a degree in philosophy. Your PhD is only uh, indirectly related to philosophy of mind. So why should we listen to you? And I don't think every ad hominem is invalid. And I thought that one was not invalid. I
yeah.
thought it was an appropriate ad hominem, and I took it to heart. And then for 3 years, I published a dozen papers in peer-reviewed academic journals, put a thesis together, and got myself a PhD. It was basically in reaction to ad hominem attacks.
Makes sense. I guess the place that I'd encountered a kind of, an effort to make a sort of scientific case for idealism before your work was Amit Goswami. I think his book, The Self-Conscious Universe, where
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
he was a theoretical physicist. He actually wrote a kind of manual, university manual on quantum mechanics, I think. And kind of like you, he also coming from an Eastern tradition, he really began to kind of make an argument that there was this underlying consciousness, and and from his perspective, there seems to be. I mean, I'm sure you know Aurobindo's work also, right?
Who?
Sri Aurobindo.
Yeah, yeah, yes.
Yeah. So,
I'm not a scholar. I don't know much, but I know who you are talking about.
yeah, sort of this idea that the sort of consciousness that is expressing itself through us is in a way building more and more complex kind of representations of itself in the physical world in order to be able to explore more and more aspects of its creative capability in a way, and that this suggests further kind of evolutionary leaps in a way. Aurobindo talked about the supramental intellects, like a future state of mind, and Goswami similarly, argued that we were kind of, somehow this consciousness which had, which went through us was developing more capacity for self-reflection and creation and so on. There would be other stages in this evolution. I don't know how that resonates with you, or what do you think about that kind of idea?
Well, it has a clear counterpart in the West, and that's Hegel, and the notion that society is a means for the absolute, which is a sort of impersonal consciousness, to explore itself through a dialectical process. And if you look at history, we definitely are visiting every room in the palace of mind, and every epoch, every historical juncture is a exhaustive exploration of some room in that palace, and not all rooms in the palace of mind are positive rooms. We have explored treacherous territory in the early 20th century, and we may be about to embark in another treacherous exploration of a nightmarish room soon. But Hegel would say that this is all a natural part of the dialectics that will lead to some kind of teleological higher state of mind that has something to do with self-recognition, self-knowledge, self-awareness. I, for one, I consider myself a naturalist in the sense that I don't think nature is guided by an explicit plan. I don't think this field of subjectivity that I hypothesize underlies our nature, I don't think it is a premeditative field. I don't think it explicitly knows what it's doing. I think it's a natural field, instinctive. You could regard it as instinctive. And it's touching and feeling its way through some kind of maze in the palace of mind. And sometimes it gets warmer, sometimes it gets colder and does harm to itself. Um, that I don't think is contradictory with the notion of teleology, with the notion that there is a purpose, but I don't think that's an explicit purpose. I think it's an instinctive purpose, and obviously, empirically speaking, and regardless of what metaphysics you hold to, what theory of reality you have, consciousness is changing at an individual and collective level. Every generation occupies a different space in the field of mind. You can clearly see that. You can see that on my previous generation from us, the baby boomers, they have a certain way of being in the world, a certain outlook. Gen Xers, like you and me, we have a different outlook, and millennials, yet another. And if you look at history, we have been through a dialectical succession of outlooks, and it's definitely going somewhere. Whether it's somewhere good or not, I don't know as a naturalist, but we are definitely going somewhere.
Um, I really enjoyed your book, the idea of the worlds, where you kind of talked about, I don't, was it sort of allegory? Is that what you're talking about? How in a way like, or analogy, how this sort of this view of consciousness as the underlying foundational reality, which sort of understands reality itself as kind of a collective dream, like a collective woven dream, then allows us to think about reality as a kind of symbolic system in the way maybe poets or mystics have thought about it. I don't know if I've characterized that accurately, but do you want to explore that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, you did a great job from a metaphorical perspective. I can try to complement it by approaching it from a very analytic perspective. We have this naive view that the world as we perceive is the world as it actually is in itself. In other words, we think of perception as a transparent window into the world. We see the world as it is through a transparent window. While we have definitive reasons, and more than one, to know that that cannot be the case. If our inner cognitive states, our perceptual states, would mirror the states of the world, there would be no upper bound to our internal entropy, and we would just dissolve into hot soup. So we cannot see the world as it is. Evolutionarily speaking, evolution doesn't favor seeing the world as it is, seeing the truth. Evolution favors survival. So we will see the world in whatever encoded version will distill what is salient for our survival and preserves our inner structure, putting a bound on our internal entropy, and still conveying enough true information about the world so we can navigate it successfully. So to put it metaphorically, we are pilots of an airplane that has no transparent windshield. We only have the instrument panel. We are flying by instruments. What we call the physical world is what is displayed on the dashboard of instruments. We have sensors like the airplane that measure the real world out there. In the case of the airplane, it's air pressure sensor, air speed sensor, and so on, air humidity. And we have retinas, eardrums, surface of the skin and the tongue and lining of the nose. These are sensors. The results of these measurements on the world as it actually is are presented to us, just like in the airplane, in the form of an internal dashboard that sort of displays what is relevant to allow you to navigate the world successfully, but doesn't display the world as it actually is. Just like the dashboard isn't the world outside, the physical world in perception isn't the world as it is. It's a representation thereof. And if you accept this, then everything on the dashboard is a symbol. Everything is telling you something behind and beyond it. Every facet of the physical world is a symbol on a dashboard. It does mean something, literally. Just like the dials on a dashboard of an airplane, the indications on those dials, they mean something. but what they mean look nothing like themselves. If an indicator of airspeed on the airplane means airspeed, but doesn't look like air flowing, you see what I mean?
Mhm.
And the same applies to the screen of perception, which is our dashboard. Everything has a meaning. Everything is pointing at something behind and beyond them, just like the instruments on the dashboard are pointing to something behind and beyond the dashboard itself in the real world outside. And that's a perspective that reinvests the physical world with literal meaning. The physical world now denotes and connotes something that transcends the physical world itself, in the same sense that the sky outside transcends the dashboard. It's not woo-woo fantasy that I'm talking about. I'm talking about something very simple and that can be argued very coherently, almost self-evident.
That makes it, but I guess one of my great heroes in a way is Rudolf Steiner. I don't know how much you've explored Steiner.
I
Uh,
haven't. I know of him.
so he actually his first book, Philosophy of Freedom, was his effort to refute Kantian dualism. This idea that there's like the phenomena of our perception, the noumena, the real objects behind them. So he ended up, I guess it's sort of, well, he called it monistic idealism. So it actually is also quite similar to your philosophy, but basically what he ended up arguing is that a philosopher or visionary in a way is kind of taking from the world of percepts and and creating concepts out of them. There's actually an infinite kind of potentiality within that space between the percept and the concept. And so then, I mean, I think it's, most people don't realize that was where he came from, but then he became very elaborate in terms of like seeing like, I mean, and he also claims that even from a, that he was like somebody who almost had like a, he wouldn't use, but a psychedelic form of perception. Like he was able to see these like astral worlds and chakras and ghosts and beings behind the normal phenomena. So he writes a lot about how like, the fires, concocted by these like fire beings. There's like gnomes and goblins under the earth that are pushing the plants up into the sun, so the sun will get more, the stars will give them more information, and then they'll use and so on. It's super fascinating, but I yeah, when I read his stuff, it has this weird, even when it seems completely absurd, I find it has like this weird resonance. Like he's created this whole other dimension, and it's not that dissimilar from when I've visited different indigenous cultures, like the Kogi or something, where they seem to live in a completely different, like symbolic structure, and within that symbolic structure, it feels like other things are possible, like things that we would consider impossible or magic would just kind of happen, and they would understand what they signify based on their language, their mythology, their way of being and knowing, which is so different than ours. So that was some of what fascinated me about the idea of the world. In a way, it almost felt like you were proposing a kind of philosophical and maybe almost like a scientifically grounded kind of way to re-explore the sort of poetic, symbolic, shamanic imagination, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. I Look, there are many theories or views that go under the label of idealism. The only unifying aspect of them all is that all of them state that reality is fundamentally mental. But from that departure point, you can have many variations. One of the variations that was popular a couple of 100 years ago was Berkeley's subjective idealism, which can be summarized in the statement, to be is to be perceived. And that sort of reifies the contents of perception as the thing in itself. And it violates the Kantian dichotomy between phenomena and noumena by basically saying that the phenomena are the noumena, that the world exists only insofar as the contents of perception, that perceptions don't represent an actual objective world outside, that perceptions are the thing in itself. In other words, reality is a kind of a dream, and somehow our dreams are synchronized and coordinated, but there is nothing beyond the images of our own dreams. I don't think that is plausible or tenable, because if you were sitting next to me, you would describe my study in a way totally consistent with my own description of it. It seems unavoidable that there is a world out there beyond our individual minds. The question is that world not mental, just like our minds are, mental in essence, mental in type, not my mind, not your mind, not personal mental processes, but transpersonal mental processes out there. You see, from your point of view, my thoughts are objective. You cannot control them. You don't even know what they are unless I express them to you. And if you were not around, I would still have my thoughts. But my thoughts are subjective in essence. So the hypothesis of objective idealisms is that there is this objective thing out there from our point of view, just like your thoughts are objective from my point of view. There are the quote thoughts of nature, which appear to us upon observation as the physical world of objects and fluids and particles and so on and so forth. But from its own point of view, the inanimate world is subjective in essence, just like my thoughts from my point of view are subjective, although they are objective from your point of view. In other words, there is a world that doesn't care what you think about it. There is a world out there that would still be out there, even if nobody were around to look at it. But it is not physical. Physicality emerges only upon a measurement, upon an interaction of a dissociated private mind with these transpersonal mental processes out there. That's when sensors measure these transpersonal mental processes and display them to an individual mind like me or you on a dashboard in the form that we call the physical world. And from that perspective, the physical world is merely what transpersonal mental processes look like upon being observed or measured. But we preserve the notion of an independent, objective world out there that would still be out there, even if there were no private minds to observe it. I think that is a necessity. I don't think one can make sense of the overwhelming evidence of just looking around and talking to other people without postulating some kind of objective states out there. I think they are mental, just like our own inner states are. But I think there are objective states that constitute the inanimate world out there. I don't know. I mean, that's not Berkeleyan idealism. It's not subjective idealism. It's a form of objective idealism. Makes a lot of sense of many of the seeming contradictions in foundations of physics today, like the measurement problem and quantum entanglement and all that. But it preserves this notion of an objective external world beyond our individual minds.
It's definitely a slightly complex idea to kind of hold on to in a way, because it's, I mean, where I mean, we understand that I have a subjective perspective, you have a subjective perspective, but you're saying that there's an intersubjective mental reality that has its own perspective in some sense. But
Yes.
where's that perspective located? Just it's an immanence in everything.
If you look at my body, it's a complex structure. Where is my subjectivity located in my body? Is it here, here, here? Where precisely?
Was it Alan Watts talked about we have this feeling of it being this tiny little thing, like sort of like 3 inches back from our forehead or something like that.
That's what it feels like, but we know that's not the case. We know that the physiology, brain activity, our mental processes, as they can be measured objectively, the ones that correlate with conscious experience are not in one location in the brain. They are everywhere. The pattern of the neurocorrelates of consciousness, or at least meta-consciousness, cannot be found in a specific place. They are distributed. In the same sense, you can regard the inanimate universe as the body of mind at large. In the same sense that my body corresponds to my dissociated inner mentation, my private mental inner life, the mental inner life of the universe at large, the inanimate universe, corresponds to a body, a representation on the dashboard of dials we call the screen of perception. And that is the galaxies and the galaxy clusters and the distribution of black matter and the dark matter and dark energy in the universe, which curiously enough, if you run the computer simulations and you simulate the grand structure of the universe at the largest scales, it is confoundingly similar from a network topology perspective to mammalian brains. And nobody has an explanation for that. There is no physical organizational process known that would account for the similarity of structure between the universe at its largest scales and mammalian brains. It seems a confounding coincidence that from a network topology perspective, they are so similar. And when I say they are similar, I don't mean that the pictures look the same. They do, but that's not what I mean. What I mean is if you do a network topology analysis based on information theory, you will get to parameters that are surprisingly in accord. So I would say, when you look up to the sky and you see the stars and the galaxies and galaxy clusters and the things you don't see, like the distributions of dark matter, you are looking at the brain of the mind of nature in exactly the same sense that when you look at my brain, you see the appearance of my mental processes from your perspective. The appearance of the mental processes of mind at large from our perspective is the night sky. So this is not more inflationary. On the contrary, it's more parsimonious, because all I'm saying is the following. Until the horizon of my personal experience, everything I can know by direct experience, by direct acquaintance, it's all mental, insofar as I know. To say that it's not mental is a theoretical abstraction. So until the horizon that I can see myself, it's all mental stuff. Now I acknowledge there is something beyond the horizon. We have to postulate that to account for the commonalities of descriptions of the world in which we live. All I'm saying is that beyond the horizon, it's more mental stuff. Now, when you're on the beach and you look at the horizon, it's all earth until the horizon. Beyond the horizon, it's more earth. Not earth you can experience yourself, but more of the same type of thing. So what I'm saying is that until the horizon of our individual minds, it's mental stuff. And beyond, it's more mental stuff. And that mental stuff, when observed from the outside, will look like matter, just like my personal mental stuff looks like matter when observed from the outside, the neurocorrelates of my consciousness. Or to give you a more mundane example, if I am sad from within and I'm crying, when I look at the mirror, the very physical, material tears running down my face and the very physical configuration of my contorted facial muscles are what my sadness look like from the outside. The matter of my tears, the matter of my contorted facial muscles is the appearance across the dissociative boundary of my conscious inner life. In other words, it's a representation of my conscious inner life on somebody else's dashboard or my own dashboard if I have a mirror to reflect them back to me. In exactly the same way, the physical universe, the galaxies, the galaxy clusters, the quasars, the black holes, the black matter, the dark matter distribution is what the mentation of mind at large looks like when represented on our dashboard upon measurement. So matter is always, under all circumstances, what conscious processes look like from across the dissociative boundary. And then you make sense of everything just by postulating nature's sole given, which is mental stuff. That's all we have before we begin to theorize. So if you can account for all observations based on mental stuff alone, not your mental stuff alone, but mental stuff in general, and nothing more than mental stuff, no other ontological category, then you have the simplest, most intuitive, most parsimonious account of what's going on.
I can't help but that resonates with, in some ways, almost like a Christian eschatology in a weird way. I was reading C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, and he talks about, whereas, kind of Eastern metaphysics, might see that kind of the Brahman, the ultimate consciousness, and the individual are ultimately indistinguishable. It's just kind of an illusion, in a way, temporary illusion, that we have this like samsaric kind of universe that the gods have kind of created, for play. The Christian idea is that there's some, I mean, according to Lewis, some kind of separation between, the expression of God through nature and the cosmos and our individual selves, which, we're given this limited opportunity for freedom and self-discovery and so on. I was looking at I guess one of your recent books. You've actually been writing a lot. I feel like I hadn't looked at your books for a little while, and suddenly there's like 10 more books or something like that. You have one called Dreamed Up Reality. Or
Oh,
maybe,
that's an old one.
what's that?
Yeah, that's an old one.
Oh, that's an old one. Well, I was curious about, because in some places you're kind of making a case for a religious mythos as a useful way for thinking about the world from a human-centered perspective. So maybe you could share some of that idea.
I think it is not surprising at all that throughout our history, different peoples, different cultures in different geographies have sort of stumbled upon the same intuitions. They only look different because of the metaphors used, which is culture bound, and but if you can sort of read through that outer layer of particular metaphors and particular value structures and particular cultural references and go into the core of the matter, it is surprising how similar they are, how similar the mythology of Australian Aboriginals is to the mythology of the Witoto in the Amazon jungle. Cultures separated not only by half a planet, but by thousands of years as well. I don't think this is by chance. I think, we have an intellect since what, 30,000 years, maybe 50, that's when symbolic reasoning, symbolic thinking arose in the human species, which curiously enough had existed already since 200,000 years ago. So it's a great mystery how suddenly symbolic thinking has emerged in our species. So the intellect is very young. It's a baby. It was born yesterday. And human beings have, and even homos of other species, humans of other species, have had other mental faculties that are not conceptual reasoning for 2 million years at least, probably 3, depending on the latest in paleoanthropology. So we have, because we are natural beings, we didn't parachute into nature. We came out of nature. We are expressions of nature. We are rooted in nature through intuitive roots that have preceded the intellect by a couple of million years at least. Now you could say, well, those intuitions are not reliable. Under certain circumstances, I would agree with that. They are certainly not reliable to derive predictive models of nature's behavior, like the latest scientific theories. But they are reliable in another sense, in the sense that they are old, and they represent our root level connection to nature, which is closer to the warm, moist facts of life than airy conceptual clouds up here, which are often detached from reality, detached from our more basic intuitive faculties. And to me, it's no surprise that because we are rooted in nature through millions of years old intuitive roots, that we figured things out much earlier than we are comfortable to admit with the modern mind. We just didn't have the language for it.
One of the myths that you look at as a common myth is the sort of myth of like the sort of half dreaming God. He created the world, kind of. Was that?
It usually has to do with a deity. In other words, a consciousness that isn't human but transcends human consciousness, which dreams existence up and then enters its own dream and becomes subject to the rules of the dream. Like, I'm not a religious scholar, so you have to take what I'm about to say with a whole bag of salt. In the Aboriginal cultures, there are many different myths, but one of them that the deity just dreams the world and then suddenly wakes up in the dream after the animals have sort of come out of his armpits. Yeah, and after he wakes up in his own dream, he's subject to the rules of the dream. So he has to kill and eat the animal in order to survive. If you go to the Witoto, the other side of the world, in the Amazon jungle, then their deity dreams a very ephemeral dream. Ephemeral in the sense that it's a very tenuous dream. It escapes very easily. It just slips through your fingers and escapes. But then the deity has the idea to sort of tie up the dream with a cord in order to prevent it from escaping. And then sort of wrestling that tenuous dream down and then stamping on it with his foot. And by stamping on it, boom, he enters the dream. And from within the dream, he creates the jungle by spitting on the ground. I mean, it's impossible not to see the glaring similarity between these two dreams. It starts with a transcendent form of consciousness in the sense that it's beyond human consciousness. It dreams up existence, then it enters its own dream. Is this in Christianity? It's obviously there. Look at the Gospel of John. The word, which is a translation of the Greek logos, which also means thinking, reasoning. So the word creates the world. Thinking creates the world. And the word, logos, is God. And then Christ is born into the world as the Son of God, who is also God, and becomes subject to the rules of the world, to the point that he can be crucified and bleeds and dies. I mean, it's there everywhere in Hinduism. In the early myths of Hinduism, God dreams the primordial waters, then drops his seed into the primordial waters that he dreamed up, and then gives birth to himself in those waters, inside what he dreamed up. I mean, it's just everywhere.
Yeah.
Of course, there is a lot of stuff that is not the same. There's a lot of, myths, when after they arise, they evolve, they begin to serve the purposes of dominant classes. Mythologies start being misused as a form of social control. This happens, things diverge. But at root, this insight that it's all consciousness, it began as the dream, an impersonal dream, and then the dreamer entered its own dream and becomes subject to the rules of the dream as localized expressions of consciousness within it. It's everywhere.
I'm sort of curious if this whole line of thinking has led you to any kind of religious practices or any of that sort.
Not really, not a structured religious practice. I mean, my mother is a Catholic, but never really pushed me in that direction. My mother is a Catholic of convenience. She will pray when she's in trouble, and prayer for her is a ritual for telling God what to do. And when you're a kid, you get this, kids get these things and get turned off immediately. So I didn't really receive those maps as a kid. The maps I received were the maps of rationality, empirical evidence, fooling around with scientific experiments when I was 6, with the help of my father giving me all kinds of dangerous chemical substances and electronic equipment to fool around with. But I take religion seriously as an adult. My journey has brought me to a place where I think religion is certainly not nonsensical. It is portrayed as nonsense by many, including many religious people who take everything literally and just destroy religion, make it flat and meaningless. But I think if you have the eyes to see the depth, the subtlety, the nuance, you will find rich territory there. I have great respect for that, even though I regret that I didn't get those maps, not as much as I wish I had gotten those maps as a kid when I was still really open to it. And I have a degree, a healthy, small degree of jealousy towards people who have a vibrant, alive religious practice. I wish I had that. I just didn't grow up with a constitution that allows me to have access to that channel. But I try to. I do pray. I do pray. I try to pray in a way that's not the same as I saw others pray when I was a kid. I don't tell God what to do. My form of prayer is sort of a surrendering of my own personal agenda. I'd say, I know it's not about me. Uh, I mean, in the game, please me the best way that I can be used. I'm open to be a means to an end for nature to express itself, whatever way it needs to express itself through me. I'm not going to fight that. My life's not about me. That's a realization I got pretty late in my life, which sort of contradicts the entire Western manual about well-being. Well-being is about making your life about you. It's about
Right.
you. You have to make a plan and get to be happy. I think that's childish stuff. I think if you mature as an adult, you get to a point where you realize it's not about you, has never been, will never be, and you don't need to understand what's going on to be useful. You just need to listen to the impersonal movements of nature within you that you may mistake for your own errant feelings and intuitions, but which are not you at all. You're a part of nature. You have never been separate. You've never been your own thing. And those movements of the impersonal are clear if you have the eyes to see. And today, I, I don't judge it. I try to pass moral judgment because sometimes the movements of the impersonal lead you to avenues that are not morally defensible. And I think we have the responsibility to pass that moral judgment as metacognitive beings. We are the metacognitive eyes of nature. But beyond, a moral call, I don't judge whether the plan is going to be effective, if you know what I mean. I don't even try to understand what my role is in the grand scheme of things. I'm a monkey walking around a rock darting through the universe. What hope do I have to understand what's going on? So to me, that's what faith is. To me, faith is I put myself in the hands of nature and I try to be the best expression of nature I can possibly be, accepting that there is no way I'm going to understand, but I do have moral responsibility. That's it.
That's interesting. I read your piece. We both submitted papers. Maybe you won something, but to that Bigelow contest about the afterlife.
Survival. Yeah.
I'll be honest with you, I was a little bit disappointed in your paper because I felt you kind of felt to me a little bit unnecessarily kind of closed off the possibility that there might be some kind of like continued existence of like the personality structure or the consciousness or the soul as a sort of kind of in its individualized a particular form. So I was curious if you wanted to sort of talk about how what you arrived at in your perspective there.
Sure. I can give you a sort of level-headed answer and then admit to my prejudices. So I will do the level-headed first, and then we get to the dirty laundry afterwards. I don't think there is enough empirical reason to postulate that consciousness continues in a personal form after the body is no longer around. I think the body is what a sort of localization or a dissociation in the field of awareness that underlies all nature looks like. The body is what personhood looks like. So if the body is no longer there, then to me, that's the empirical clue that localized consciousness is no longer there. Am I worried about that? Not the least. Not the least. I think you don't mourn the death of your personalized dream avatar when you wake up in the morning. But when you wake up in the morning, your dream avatar is dead. That was a personalization of your mind within your mind. You think you are your dream avatar and not the rest of the dream. Well, in fact, you are the whole thing. You were doing the whole thing. The dream avatar, the other people in the dream, the houses, the trees, the cars, the events. And when you wake up, you realize, oh, I have never been the dream avatar. I was the one doing the whole thing. You don't mourn the death of your dream avatar when you wake up. And for the same reason, I don't think I will mourn the death of Bernardo Kastrup once my state of consciousness has become not dissociated anymore, once my cognitive inner life, my cognitive states are reintegrated into a broader cognitive context. Yeah. Personally, I'm not worried about that. But my reason to defend that is purely empirical. I'm not closed to the possibility that some form of personality structure survives physical death. I think it is a coherent thesis. The question is, do we have good enough empirical reasons to pursue this hypothesis? At this stage, I don't think we have. Um, so that's my official position. Now, my prejudices are the following. I hope personhood doesn't survive because it is a state of consciousness supremely prone to suffering. And I mean, it's no secret. I have done high dose psychedelic trips in the past. I thought it was my intellectual responsibility as somebody writing about consciousness to investigate that from a first person perspective. I have done
Which psychedelics?
mostly psilocybin. I have done salvia divinorum as well, but the salvia trip is never as insightful because it's too short and it's too crazy. It's never it didn't serve my purposes as well as a high dose psilocybin trip. I've done 8 grams, dried grams of psilocybin, and in the beginning, ego dissolution is very hard because you're sure you're dying, and you are dying. But after a while, you don't bother with that anymore. Ego dissolution, you know the territory. You just surf through that. There's nothing to worry about, and you ace that. But then what started happening to me is that returning from a delocalized state of consciousness in which you are not subject to constraints in time and space became supremely painful. I call it the re-entry. And it crushed me every single time. It crushed me for a week. It took a week for me to sort of accept this state of mind, this state of consciousness in which you have to get, I had this vision in a re-entry once, my little self inside a black metal box, having to use the metal box to go from one place to another. That's a car. I drive a black sedan. Or a table representing the days of the week, that those little 7 divisions on a table govern your whole life. That was so claustrophobic, so crushing to me every single time that I slowed down on my learning plan. And I haven't done a psychedelic trip in a few years now. So I hope personhood doesn't survive. I don't fancy this state. I'm not going to say it's an error of nature. I think nature is natural. It's spontaneous. It's not making premeditated decisions. But that's my prejudice. And therefore, it's very easy for me to just point to the empirical evidence and say, we don't have enough of it to think personhood survives, all right? Because, that's what I'm cheering for.
What about the possibility that, I mean, a lot of mystical traditions talk about kind of subtler planes or dimensions of consciousness, like astral planes or etheric planes or something. Do you think there's the possibility that, kind of different forms of consciousness exist in those other sort of layers or subtler dimensions of consciousness? I mean, for instance, many people, myself included, have the experience, with ayahuasca or iboga, that it almost feels there's like a personality that kind of exists in a separate realm that creates like an interactive field when you have that experience, and offers you particular teachings and guidance and so on.
I think it's entirely coherent to think that that can be the case for a simple reason. The physical world is our internal dashboard representation of what is salient about the environment we are immersed in. We have to be given salient information about what's going on so we can navigate life and survive and reproduce. But that doesn't mean that things that aren't salient or relevant are not there. We would just not have evolved to pick them out. If they don't have a bearing on our survival, then perception wouldn't have evolved to pick it out. It would be redundant information that could lead to confusion or to even delayed reaction to environmental challenges, which we would not have evolved for. That characteristic would have been abandoned by evolution, would have been driven to extinction. So I think statistically speaking, it is a near certainty that there is a lot more going on than we can pick up with sense perception or with instruments we build, because the very instruments we build are ultimately filtered by sense perception. We have to see the output of those instruments. You have to see the photos from a telescope. You have to see down the lens of a microscope. You have to see the screen of an oscilloscope. Everything gets filtered out by our dashboard. So even the instruments we make to extend the dashboard are ultimately structurally confined to the paradigm of the dashboard. So I would say it's a virtual certainty that there is a lot more going on in our cognitive neighborhood than we have the ability to perceive, conceive, or even have language for.
Excellent. Well, I mean, I don't want to hold you forever, but I mean, I guess I was sort of interested. I was really happy to see that you talked about Patrick Harpur's work in one of your books.
Yeah.
But you kind of ended up having a critique of kind of his, his ideas, I guess, from was it the Philosopher's Secret Fire or something. But it was sort of a subtle critique. I was wondering if you could sort of share it if you remember well enough.
Yes. I think Patrick Harpur is one of the finest and most unrecognized scholars of our age.
Absolutely.
I think, and I say this with absolute sincerity, I think I am very lucky to have lived in the time of Patrick Harpur. I don't say this lightly.
Yeah.
I've learned a lot from him. I think the subtlety of his understanding of what's going on is almost unmatched. He has dug into a well that most people don't even see. They may step over it and won't even see. I do think that and the basis, the grand summary, which will inevitably be unfair, but that's all I can do in an interview. The grand summary of what he says is that what's really going on is fluidic and has multiple facets, and you can't pin it down. Whenever you think you pinned it down, it shows you the opposite aspect of what you think it is. So it's internally self-contradictory. It's mercurial. It is always reinventing and changing itself like a changeling. So you can't pin it down. You can't articulate.
And it's just we can just as much we sort of interpret the sort of Shemitic or alchemical kind of worldviews through the scientific rational lens, but he kind of reverses it and interprets the world of science and rationality and technology as these sort of imaginal projections just as much as anything else.
Exactly, and I think that is true. I think he's right, but I also think that in being right, he didn't go as far as we can go with linear reasoning. And that was my critique. I think he's ultimately right, but that doesn't mean that we should surrender linear reasoning too soon. We can go further. In other words, we can have a less wrong linear story. We can be less wrong than we are now.
Yeah.
And it is worthwhile to be less wrong, and then a little bit less wrong, and less wrong. And one day we will face a wall. And beyond that wall is non-Aristotelian logic. You have to abandon Aristotelian logic. You have to abandon the law of excluded middle, the idea that something is either true or false, and necessarily one of the two, but never both. Right. That has to be abandoned. It's an arbitrary axiom anyway. But I think before we hit that wall, we can improve our story a lot. And I think there is a lot of social value in having our story be less wrong before we are ready as a culture to make that fundamental transition, that translogical transition, which today is completely unrealistic. And I think it will be unrealistic for this entire century. So there is where I think he didn't drop the ball, but that's where I think he can be misinterpreted. People can take his insight as meaning, well, then, whatever story we'll come up with, it's all wrong anyway, so why should we think straight? No, I think we can think straight and improve our story.
Right. sometimes I wonder if when I was just reading a little bit, Benjamin Whorf, who was a linguist who wrote about the Hopi language, and how these indigenous languages like the Hopi have very different, phenomenological approaches to the nature of reality that are not necessarily less precise than ours. They might actually be more precise. If they don't, apparently the Hopi don't really talk about past, present, and future. They talk about the sort of the subjective and the objective, or the unmanifest and the manifest. So you have things that have not like come into manifestation, which are sort of still in the unmanifest. And you have, the shared reality. I mean, just feels like there might be a lot of um, yeah, important. I mean, to fine tune this sort of idealist worldview in a way in the future, we might have to sort of re-examine indigenous knowledge systems and language in a very profound way. I would think. I don't know.
I completely agree with you, but I think a necessary step for us to be able to do that productively is to recognize that we ourselves do the same that they do. If you think that the mythology of the Hopi cannot be literally true, then you may be right. But what you have to understand is that our science, our models of reality, they too are just convenient fictions that are changing all the time throughout the history of science. And if you understand that we too, our models are convenient fictions as well, metaphors,
Yeah.
the stories that nature behaves as if those stories were true. That's all we have. And it's the humility of understanding that we too only have convenient fictions that will allow us to see these other cultures, the value of what they put forward correctly. Otherwise, we will always have that prejudice that, oh, we know better because our models are the truth, right?
Right.
And
I
theirs is
got I
just
got over that
mythology.
prejudice a while. I got over that prejudice a while back. But I hear you.
Most people haven't,
I
and
get no, for
most
sure.
people most people don't understand that the history of science is the
Yeah.
history of bad convenient fictions that have been discarded, and that there is no reason to think that the current convenient fiction will last
Right.
forever.
I'm
It too
sure.
will be discarded.
I'm sure you've explored Rupert Sheldrake and his whole idea that even this idea of the laws of nature was just an ideological kind of construct, that actually probably nature doesn't have laws. It has more like habits, patterns that become more coherent or something like that.
Physics is coming around to that now in the last 10 years.
Oh yeah, that's
I
fascinating.
think Rupert is one of the most sort of uh, pure, um, untarnished scientific minds we have alive today. He is the embodiment of the archetypal scientist. And he gets a lot of heat from pseudoscientists or science popularizers who are not scientists themselves, and frankly, idiots like Jerry Coyne, who is a fun idiot, probably a nice guy to have a beer with, but an idiot, okay, who contradicts himself left and right, doesn't
Yeah.
know what he's talking about. But Rupert is a fine scientific mind, and physics is catching up to him. Today, there is a very serious hypothesis taken very seriously in physics that the laws of nature are not fixed in stone. They are not etched in stone. They are, like Rupert said, they are more like habits, and they may fluctuate over time. There is a theory by a physicist I like very much, but his name escapes me right now. I forgot his name, but um, he put forward in his latest book that we can model the laws of nature as we know them today. We can model them in an uncannily appropriate way by regarding them as neural networks, the workings of a neural network. And if that's the case, then the universe has been learning its laws of nature. They are not fixed. They are just the present state of learning of what is essentially a sort of a neural network mental model of the universe. Oh, I forgot his name. I think he's the head of the American Association of Black Physicists.
Uh-huh.
Um, I forgot his name, but he's a top guy.
Okay.
One of the few
Yeah.
subtly thinking physicists out
Nice.
there who can think beyond the boundaries of formal logic.
I wanted to ask you maybe two more questions. One is just about your foundation, the work you're doing now. It's kind of to substantiate the idealist kind of paradigm, or tell me a little bit, and how are you going about that in that case?
Yeah, it's Essentia Foundation. Our founder identified a sort of a gap in our media. Usually idealism, this notion that reality is essentially mental, it is defended from a first-person perspective. In other words, on the basis of meditative insights or psychedelic experiences or religious revelations. There's plenty of argumentation for idealism from this introspective perspective. But we think there are excellent, compelling cases, maybe even definitive cases to be made for idealism that do not leverage introspection at all and are purely based on, an analytic reasoning and empirical evidence from foundations of physics, from the neuroscience of consciousness. So, and idealism is almost never defended from that direction in the media. So we thought we are going to fill that gap. So the foundation aims at doing exactly that, at sort of collecting and curating the arguments and the evidence for idealism based purely on reason and evidence, not introspection.
So it doesn't do original like field research in a sense. It's more like a think tank in a sense.
No, we don't do field research. We try, but we may sponsor work that we think is appropriate for our charter. So we've never done that, but it's one of the possibilities we have in our charter to provide scholarships, for instance, to stimulate researchers to look more into this particular area. Like there are many looking into panpsychism today. Maybe we can help stimulate research there. And we do a lot of publishing. We publish essays, we publish books. We have Essentia books now on imprint. We organize a yearly conference online. Last year it was about neuroscience. This year it's going to be about physics, foundations of physics. Yeah, that's basically it. It's mostly sort of almost academic-based journalistic work directed at the public at large, not only academics.
I guess the next thing I was curious about, I mean, okay, so at the moment, materialism, reductive materialism is still, let's say, the mainstream belief paradigm, I guess. And the sense is that idealism is actually a more logical, paradigm that actually corresponds more with the actuality of the world that we're learning about. So what would happen? I mean, and we're also seeing a world that's obviously increasingly in peril with the environmental mega crisis. I mean, you're running your fan because it's never been so hot in Holland. Putin is and all these dictators are getting together to build up their nukes and so on. Do you think that this a shift towards idealism could have some impacts on the world in some positive sense, or maybe in some negative sense? I don't know. I mean, how would it be registered in human collective capacity?
I think a shift is inevitable. A shift to idealism is inevitable because reason and evidence are not something you can misrepresent forever. At some point, you have to bite the bullet and you have to face the facts. And the facts speak very loudly in foundations of physics, in analytic philosophy, and the neuroscience of consciousness. Idealism is the only story we have today that is still tenable. Now, when will it happen? I don't know. If I had to risk a guess, I would say surely in our lifetimes, but we will be old people. That would be my guess. What it would change, I think what it would correlate with, I think idealism would be as much a consequence as a cause of what I'm about to say. This is think of it as a network paradigm. Everything is a cause and an effect. It synergizes and arises together. It co-arises. What will co-arise with idealism is respect for our mental inner life. We will stop thinking that our traumas, our emotions, our depression are just useless mechanistic byproduct of brain activity, and therefore you are perfectly fine to oppress your traumas, to repress the bad feelings in you, because it's all for nothing anyway. They are epiphenomenal anyway. You don't need to do any work in integration, in maturing, in becoming an adult. Just pop a pill to feel better, and let's go about life as a tool for the power structures currently with their hands on the levers of society. That would change. Now, our mental inner life is the thing in itself. It's not a byproduct, it's what really matters. And if that is the case, then life is not about collecting shoes or cars or houses or clothes. Life is about collecting insights, because insights now are the thing in itself. Suffering acquires meaning. You don't suffer for nothing. Your suffering will be the carrier of a new perspective, a new insight, a new relationship with yourself, with the rest of nature, with other people. And when you die, you seed those insights into a broader cognitive context. And it's not for nothing that the Reaper is portrayed as a character carrying a harvesting instrument. That's how the Reaper is always portrayed. There is an intuition behind that mythology. If we are dissociated processes of the mind of nature and we develop metacognitive insights throughout life, if life is what dissociation looks like, then death is the end of the dissociation and the making available of those insights to a broader context in the field of subjectivity that underlies nature. It is literally harvesting in the most positive way that one can imagine. And if life becomes about collecting insights, then everything changes. Capitalism, as it's carried out today, will lose its fuel. You will no longer need to collect stuff. You will no longer need to buy stuff to repress whatever uncomfortable feeling or trauma or unresolved issue is within you. You'll probably face them, and we will finally become adults, because today we are a society of adolescents, 8-year-old adolescents running countries. That will change. So I'm positive about that. The question is, will our civilization survive that, until that happens? There's a good chance that it will not, and the risk that it will not has never been higher than right now as we talk.
Yeah. Yeah, but I've written a lot about this idea that in the same way individuals go through kind of initiatory crises, in like indigenous cultures, whatever. It's almost like as a species, we're in an initiatory crisis. Like we have to make a mutational leap to a kind of adults responsible way of being, and we don't seem to be able to do that in any way except through some harrowing, catastrophic situation. And then the question is whether there'll be enough time and latitude left for that mutation to happen or that leap to happen.
Do you see that happening at a social level, a cultural level, like an initiation process for our civilization as a whole?
I think it would happen on every level. I mean,
you did propose that in Breaking Open the Head, I think, or in the other book, but
yeah,
you did suggest, huh?
Yeah, I think in the 2012 book, particularly, I was talking about that.
Yeah, the Quetzalcoatl, whatever.
Quetzalcoatl, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. I talked about idealism in that book too. I talked about Amin Goswami's work at that point. Yeah.
I think if we are undergoing a initiation process at a civilization level, we seem to need a lot of them, and we seem to need a lot of those initiation processes, which may be the case. It may very well be the case. Maybe different generations forget the previous initiation ritual. We had one not long ago in the continent where I'm speaking to you from, in Europe. That was the Second World War. There were pitched battles on the street where I am. Actually, even in medieval times, I mean, I had a friend from, it's an anecdote, but it's true, it's a true story. A friend from Germany came here because psychedelics are legal in the Netherlands, and she wanted very much to have that experience once. So she tripped in my guest room here, and in her trip, there was a soldier who appeared to her dressed in medieval clothes, told her name, and he had been killed in a battle that had taken place right here. And she knew the year, it was 16 something. And when she came back, she reported it to me. I looked it up, and lo and behold, there was a battle right here where my house is in that year. And the whole story that she told fits perfectly with that event. So we need a lot of initiation rituals. And that's the sad thing. I mean, individuals need one, but a civilization seems to need a lot. Things get lost from one generation to the other.
Right, but there are
Unfortunately.
learnings which last, I think. I mean, the Maya, for instance, in Yucatan, may have gone through some catastrophic collapse of their civilization, then actually ended up having a truly kind of sustainable ethos for the next 1,000 years or something before we came along. So I mean, in this case, it's like there's human against human, and there's human maybe against the community of life as a whole. Like we've kind of separated from the community of life. We've gotten lost in our mental world and our egoism and so on, and somehow have to find our way back to that larger community of life. You know.
We seem to need recurring reminders. After the Second World War, the European Union, I remember in the 80s as a kid, the European Union was a numinous project. It was not just a political project, it was a numinous thing. There was a kind of sacredness to it,
Yeah.
a kind of ideal sacredness to it. It irradiated that. Today, it's engulfed by cynicism. So do we need now a war with Russia or nuclear accidents 10 times worse than Chernobyl to sort of go through that spiral arc again? Maybe. I don't know. I'm not really an optimist. I think if we survive as a civilization, idealism will be mainstream. It's just inescapable.
Yeah.
You can't fool around with reason and evidence for too long. At some point, you just have to acknowledge what's in front of you. But I'm not certain we will make it as a civilization. As a species, we will. There is
Yeah.
always the Australian Aboriginal, the African Bushman, the Northern Inuit who have the skills to survive without the civilization. It's just you and me.
Oh yeah,
We may not.
we're toast.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a pity.
Well, we'll see what happens. But Bernardo, it was so wonderful to finally get a chance to speak with you. I've been really a big admirer of your books. I've been telling everybody about them, and hopefully we'll be in touch more. And
The respect is mutual,
yeah,
Daniel.
thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Have a wonderful day, and thanks for the chat.
You too. Take care.